It was a warm summer day on August 27th, 1906. A baby boy was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin. That boy would turn into a monster, known as the Butcher of Plainfield. He would be an inspiration for the 1960 Alfred Hitchcock classic Psycho, the 1974 Tobe Hooper movie The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the character Buffalo Bill in the 1991 classic Silence of the Lambs. His name was Edward Theodore Gein. Ed's father's name was George, his mother Augusta, and his older brother Henry. Ed's mother was extremely religious, mainly conservative Lutheran with strict beliefs. She believed in the Bible wholeheartedly and used it to live her life and teach her sons how to live theirs. Augusta saw the world as sinful and full of temptations. She feared moral corruption from almost every corner of society. Augusta believed that all women, except for herself, were corrupt, sinful, and immoral. She believed women led men into sinful temptation. Augusta was completely against sexuality. That was also sinful. She was disgusted by sex. She discouraged Henry and Ed from having any relationships. Sexual desire was inherently evil in her mind. The only reason that she had children was because it was her religious duty. Augusta taught her children with an iron fist. She often berated them if they did not meet her strict moral standards. She would give daily Bible lessons and taught her children the dangers of sin. She read mostly from the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation. Ed's father George was an abusive alcoholic for most of his life. Even though he married Augusta, she hated him. George could barely hold down a job. He did mostly odd jobs as a carpenter, tanner, insurance salesman, and as a grocer. Augusta supported the family in La Crosse. She owned a small grocery store. Her husband worked there as a clerk before they left La Crosse. She absolutely hated George. She thought that he was worthless, and she did not want him raising their two sons. She believed that everyone in La Crosse was sinful. It was a larger town at around 30,000 people, and it had many bars. Augusta wanted her family to move into the country, away from such a corrupt society. When Ed was 8 years old, the family moved to Plainfield, Wisconsin, a tight-knit rural farming community with a few hundred residents. But Augusta would soon hate all of the residents. They were not up to her standards. They were sinful and immoral. Of course, Augusta was in charge of where the family would live, and she chose an isolated farmhouse with no electricity or plumbing on 155 acres of land. Ed and Henry went to a one-room schoolhouse with just 12 students. That was usually the only time Augusta allowed her sons to leave the family farm. When they weren't at school, they were either doing chores or working around the farm, or learning about the Bible from Augusta, or being beaten by their drunken father. Ed was an average student, and he loved reading, and he excelled at it. But in 1920, when Ed was 14, he dropped out of school. Ed did not have friends, and when he did try to make friends, his mother was completely against it. Ed would work on the family farm. His father's alcoholism would get worse, along with his abuse. On April 1st, 1940, George Gein, at age 66, would die from heart failure. His death now offered Henry and Ed a chance to leave the family farm during the day. They were allowed to go work odd jobs to bring in money. Henry and Ed both worked as handymen, but Ed would also babysit kids around town. The brothers got the reputation as trustworthy, good hard workers. Augusta favored Ed over Henry and made sure that he knew it. Ed had a strange attachment to his mother that went further than just being a mama's boy. Henry became worried about this and even criticized his mother around Ed. When Ed heard his brother talking badly about Augusta, he would become overly upset. After the start of World War II, Ed was forced to go to Milwaukee to get a physical. Ed had a growth in his eye which caused him to have bad vision. He failed the physical because of this. This was the only time that he had traveled so far from home. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were burning brush in a marshy area on their property when the fire that they had lit got out of control and started spreading across the property and even endangered some of the surrounding farms. Ed supposedly became separated from Henry. Firefighters were called and went to contain the fire. After the fire was put out, Ed reported that his brother was missing. When the search party arrived, it was reported that Ed brought the searchers directly to Henry's body. He was laying face down on a burned part of the property, but his clothing was not burned and he did not have any burns on his body. They believed that he died from a heart attack since his body seemed unharmed. The police did not believe it was foul play. The coroner later found that the cause of death was asphyxiation. There was no autopsy or investigation into Henry's death. It has been reported that Henry had bruising on the back of his head, supposedly from hitting a rock after he fell, choking on the smoke and ash from the fire. But some believe that Ed killed his brother, or that Augusta ordered Ed to kill Henry. Ed could have hit Henry over the head, killed him, then lit the fire after the fact to give a reason for Henry's death. Whatever the case may be, Ed was never charged for his brother's death, and it is still considered an accident. After Henry's death, that just left Ed and Augusta alone on the farm, the abusive mother and dedicated son. A short time later, Augusta suffered a stroke that affected her mobility, so Ed had to become her primary caregiver. He would often have to carry her to move her around. This caused Ed to become even more attached to his mother. An event happened in 1945 that showed just how different Augusta's beliefs were. Ed and his mother went to buy straw for their animals from a man named Smith. When they arrived, they witnessed a horrible sight. Smith was beating a dog to death. A woman came out of the house onto the front porch and started yelling at him to stop repeatedly, but Smith eventually killed the dog. Augusta was severely disturbed by this, but not for the reason any reasonable person would think. She could not have cared less about the dog. Augusta was upset that there was a woman inside Mr. Smith's house because Mr. Smith and the woman were not married. Augusta called the woman a harlot. At age 67, Augusta Gein died on December 29, 1945, after suffering another stroke. Her death marked a significant turning point in Ed's life. He was now left completely alone, and his mother, who had been the backbone in his life, was now gone. Ed boarded up his mother's bedroom, the upstairs, downstairs parlor, and living room to preserve them and keep them just the way his mother left them. Ed's mother had insisted on keeping the house tidy when she was alive, or most likely she demanded that it be kept clean. Now that she was gone, Ed stayed in a small room by the kitchen and mainly used those two rooms. They increasingly became filthy, with the rooms he boarded up staying pristine. He refused to bathe himself. Ed began reading more books and magazines about human anatomy, cannibalism, and Nazi atrocities. Ed also began to leave the farm for work, doing odd jobs around town. He worked with the municipal road crew. He babysat and picked crops around Plainfield. He also sold 80 acres of land that his brother Henry owned. Mary Hogan was a 51-year-old tavern owner in Plainfield. She disappeared on December 8, 1954. She was known to speak her mind and cursed like a sailor. Her tavern was a place for locals to wind down after a hard day of work, including Ed Gein. Witnesses found blood stains on the floor of the tavern, along with an empty bullet casing. Her body was missing, but a trail of blood made police think that Mary was no longer alive. The case went cold due to little evidence. It was reported Ed joked about the woman not being missing, that she was back at his farm, but no one in Plainfield believed his jokes. On November 16, 1957, it was the first day for deer season in Wisconsin, so most of the men in Plainfield were out in the woods that day deer hunting. Then, as it is today, deer hunting was a big deal in Wisconsin. The previous day, Ed Gein visited Bernice Warden's hardware store in Plainfield to ask about the price of antifreeze, and stated that he would return the following morning to purchase half a gallon. The next day was expected to be slow due to deer season, but the hardware store remained open. Bernice's son, Frank Warden, was a sheriff's deputy. He entered his mother's store that afternoon to find the cash register missing. A rifle had been moved from the rack, and a trail of blood on the floor leading to the back. Frank Warden raised the alarm about his mother's disappearance. Frank suspected Ed Gein immediately, since Ed had taken a liking to his mother, but Bernice did not share the same feelings towards Ed. Also, the last receipt that Bernice had written up that day was for antifreeze. Authorities obtained a search warrant for Ed Gein's property, and Ed was arrested that night. The police entered the summer kitchen behind Ed's farmhouse and began searching. Bernice Warden's body was found decapitated and hung upside down by her ankles. She had been cut open and cleaned out. That image horrified the investigators. At first they thought it had been a dressed deer hanging from the rafters, but it was the body of Bernice. She had been killed by a .22 caliber rifle, then taken to the back of the store. A vehicle was seen driving off from behind the building at around 9:30 that morning. When the investigators moved into the farmhouse, they were not prepared for the horrors they would uncover. I'm going to leave out most of the details, but the information is out there. We will go over just the basics. Bernice Warden's heart was found in a plastic bag in front of Ed's wood stove, and her head was inside of a sack. Human skulls had been affixed to the posts of Ed's bed. There was furniture made out of bone and skin. Human bones were found scattered around the house. A trash can was made from human skin. The tops of skulls had been made into bowls. Ed made a corset out of a female torso. There were leggings made from skin, masks made from the faces of victims. Mary Hogan's face was found. Ed had turned it into a mask, which police found in a paper bag. Her skull was also found inside of his house. Body parts from teenage women, a belt made from female body parts, a lampshade and chair made from human skin, a suit made from the skins of deceased women, which Ed reportedly wore to try and become more like his mother. There were countless body parts and bones around the property. Some had even been turned into tools, and the list goes on and on. The smell was unbearable for the investigators, and some were severely traumatized by the event. After Ed's arrest, he was questioned by police. He claimed that between 1947 and 1952, he was involved in grave robbing at 3 local cemeteries. He claimed he was in a dazed state, and most of the time he would come out of his daze and leave the cemetery without grave robbing. But there were occasions where he succeeded in grave robbing during his dazed state. He would grave rob from people who had recently died. At night, he would dig down, retrieve the victim, and then cover the grave back the way he had found it. He used the skills his father had taught him as a tanner. The police did not believe him at first. They did not possibly think that he could dig down, rob the grave, and then cover it perfectly all in one night. The police went to test his confession and dug up a few graves to see if he was telling the truth. One casket was completely empty. Ed's crowbar was found in another, and parts of another body were missing. Ed had removed some jewelry and left it inside the grave. The exact number of victims is unknown, since only a few graves were tested. Ed would eventually confess to the murders of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. He shot Bernice with a .22 caliber rifle, and he shot Mary with a .32 caliber pistol. There are possibly more victims that Ed Gein murdered, but none have been proven. Unfortunately, Ed Gein's confession was ruled inadmissible at court. During questioning, Sheriff Art Schley reportedly smashed Ed Gein's head against a brick wall. This act caused his first confession to be thrown out. The sheriff was traumatized by the search and horrors he witnessed. He died young at age 43. It was believed this trauma caused his early death. Ed was initially declared incompetent to stand trial due to his mental illness. He was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Ed Gein's belongings were supposed to be auctioned on March 30th, 1958 to the highest bidder. But 10 days before the auction, Ed Gein's farmhouse caught fire and was burned to the ground with all of its belongings inside. The official explanation was that a trash pile that was being burned by a cleaning crew in preparation for the auction had spread to the house, but there is no real evidence found of this. Arson was suspected, but never confirmed. The locals definitely did not want the house to become a House of Horrors sideshow in their town. Some believe local citizens or local police burned the house down to keep its contents from being spread into the public. Ed Gein was told about the fire, and it is said that he just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Just as well." Ed Gein's 1949 Ford sedan was auctioned off for $760, which is worth about $8,000 in 2024, to a carnival sideshow owned by Bunny Gibbons. It would be known as the Ed Gein Ghoul Car. It was traveled around, and Bunny Gibbons charged 25 cents admission to see the sideshow. 2,000 people came to see the car in the first 2 days of the show. In 1968, after another evaluation, Ed was found competent to stand trial. It started on November 7, 1968. A psychiatrist testified that Ed told him that the morning of the murder, Ed was looking over a rifle at the hardware store when the weapon discharged and killed Bernice. He claimed he was not sure if it was by accident or on purpose. He did not remember anything else from that morning. His trial had no jury. A judge would decide Ed's fate. The judge declared that Ed Gein was guilty of Bernice Worden's murder. A second trial was held to decide if Ed was sane at the time of the murder. Ed Gein was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Because of the costs for another trial, he was not charged in the murder of Mary Hogan, even though he confessed to the murder. Ed Gein did well in the mental health system. He again had order in his life and someone to tell him what to do every day. After his mother's death, he had spiraled out of control, and now he was doing better in the mental institution. Ed Gein died from complications due to lung cancer on July 26, 1984. He was 77 years old. I want to thank y'all for watching this, folks. I know it was a tough one with a lot of horrible information in this episode, but history is history, and I hope you enjoyed nonetheless. We will see you on the next one, folks. Peace.